Well, welcome to the Friday Bubble. As you might have realised, we took a small break in January and we're planning to do that through February. But I'm hoping to be back with my colleague Essi Avellan in mid-March. So in the meantime, I wanted to just bring you one Friday Bubble because Dom Perignon has just been released, the 2013 vintage. Now everyone's been asking me, what is 2013? And of course the obvious question is, how does it compare to its predecessor? 2012 got some really good press, so we're going to talk a little bit about 2013. Now obviously one of the start points here is the climate and how was the year, because obviously that has such a massive impact on what we eventually see in the bottle. So we had another one of these fairly challenging weather years, and there was basically a late start to the year. So in some parts of Champagne, the flowers weren't setting until the early part of July, so relatively late for the year. So 2013 is also famous for being the last late harvest. So one of the things that really helped was obviously starting late in the year meant the harvest pushed back, and the grapes were getting ready towards the end of September. Most of them were picked in October, and this is the last classic October harvest that Champagne has seen. Just global warming. So let's have a little look. I haven't tasted this before, so we're going live on this together. As with most Dom Perignon vintages, the blends are actually relatively similar year on year. So this has just a slight dominance of Pinot Noir over the Chardonnay. It's nearly all Grand Cru fruit, and those of you who know Dom Perignon well know that they nearly always include the fruit from its home, so the village of Hautevillers, which is a Premier Cru rated village, but incredibly good fruit from there. So the 2013, what would we expect? Now, I've always said to a lot of people, they're a bit like a combination of a 2012 with 2008 and somewhere between. So 12 was always very fruit forward. 8 was a little bit more restrained and much more mineral. Now, I've tried to describe 13s as somewhere as like a combination of those two vintages. We've got the thing that jumps out at me to start is some beautiful citrusy lime and actually grapefruit fruit, which isn't normally what I pick up straight away with Dom Perignon. There's a little bit of that smoky, the gunflint, the classic Dom Perignon signature, but it's quite subtle in this vintage. It's not at all dominant. There's some lovely leesy character, and I think that's perhaps more prominent than the gunflint, which is interesting. Let's have a taste. So on the palate, the layers really build. Wow, that's a beautiful texture. There's an abundance of those lovely sort of really ripe lemons, ripe citrus fruit. There's a little bit of lime in there. The grapefruit's really interesting, actually. So I'd love to know where perhaps some of the Chardonnay has come from, because it seems to have that zingy, grapefruity character. And then the red fruits, as though they're not that apparent at the moment because it's just opened, you can just feel some of those beautiful red fruits on the mid palate. Dosage classically for where DP is at the moment is 5 grams, and you can taste that. There's a real weight of fruit which is beautiful. The dosage seems to not at all be light. 5 grams is kind of, I suppose, on the light side. Beautiful fruit. Now, I'm going to do, because I think the interest comes here when we do the comparison of the two vintages. 2012, quite a different year. The yields in 2013 were higher. So they were, classically at about just over 12,000 kilos a hectare. Now in 2012, the one I'm just opening, yields were much smaller, sort of around the 9,000 kilogram level. So a very different year. Now the classic difference between the two is harvest wasn't as late, There was some issues in the spring with frosts, and as a result, the yields ended up being that much lower, as I just mentioned. And this was a later September harvest, so not as late as 13. But one of the key factors of 12 was there was quite a lot of coolness. They had some real heat in August, but they had very cool nights. And that sort of big swing of temperatures day and night really helped preserve the acidity. 2012, smaller harvest. There was a little bit of weather issues in the spring, so there wasn't as much fruit set. And this was harvested much earlier as well. So this was early September rather than October. Now, the real classic difference with 12 as a vintage was that it was cold at night. So August was hot in 2012, actually very hot, but because they had lovely cool nights, that swing of temperature helped preserve the acidity. So what we had in classic 2012 was really lovely fruit and bright freshness from the acidity. So let's have a look at this one. And immediately you can see the difference. There is that more forward fruit here. You can get, I think perhaps the biggest difference is the tropical element. And that's always what I see as perhaps an indicator of a lovely warm year, is you get some of those. There's just a little bit of like something like guava or perhaps pineapple in here. And again on the palate, lovely texture, the layers that they're built up. A lot more red fruit of this, being quite prominent on the palate actually, the red fruit's really delicious. Disgorgements, of course, will play a little bit of a role here. So the 2013 was disgorged in October 2021, and the 12 was actually just a slight bit over a year before. So there's a little bit of benefit from time post disgorgement. The 12's gorgeous. It's that. It's what I call that vintage that sort of seduces you, really. It's got forward fruit and beautiful balancing freshness. There is pineapple, definitely. And there's a little bit of spice in the 2012, which is really interesting. Now, I want to go back and have a look, because now this has had a few minutes in the glass. It kind of balances up post-disgorgement time, almost. Now there we go. So this is definitely showing a bit more of its personality now with a bit more time. There's a lot more of the sort of darker fruit coming through now. A little bit of the classic gunflint, but it really is the lees, beautiful sort of leesy character on this. And I always, when we do these tastings with Essi, I always ask, which one are you preferring today? This would be a really difficult choice. I think purely as they stand today, I'd prefer the 12, just because it's had a bit more post-disgorgement time. The 13 needs more time before you drink it. So that's going to be a really interesting one to taste. In fact, if you look at scores, Essi scored them both pretty much identical. So she's always rated 12s. And it's interesting to see, she's unfortunately not here, but the best I could do was just read her tasting note, because she says, at first the nose comes across soft and toasty, less on the gunpowder, but more on the toasted bread side. That's interesting. A little shy perhaps, but the bouquet is impeccably pure and deliciously fruity once it reveals more of itself after a short while in the glass. There's ripe yellow plum, but also a brisk menthol breeze, as well as some sweeter, even tropical aromas. All nuances are perfectly integrated and elegantly subtle for the time being, echoing a reservedness, speaking of longevity. On the soft, cushiony palate, the linearity and vivacity are first to be noted, but soon after, one gets charmed by the creamy, caressing texture. The dosage is perfectly balanced at 5 grams, much racier and perhaps a little bit more austere than most recent Dom Perignon vintages. However, this cool, fruity, tight and focused wine has what true longevity takes. It has evolved slowly until now and will be one to definitely improve over time. So Essi scored it 95 with a potential of 98 out of 100. So an incredibly good score, really. It's interesting to really see these side by side. As I say, Today the 12's no doubt, as it always has, showing off a little bit. The 13 I'm really intrigued by because it is. I'm glad to see Essi's found the same similar thing. She found a menthol breeze, which I haven't. The one thing going back to it I'm seeing much more of is there is that mineral salinity in it. Beautiful red cherries and almost, like a little bit of rhubarb and other interesting red fruits coming through. I think the texture of the 13 is the thing that really wows me at the moment. So there's my quick summary. 12 absolutely gorgeous with a bit of post disgorgement time. 13 is probably one of my tips really. I think give it some time and it's going to be a very beautiful, subtle, restrained Dom Perignon. So for today, I'm going to cheers with the 12. For tomorrow, I'm going to cheers with the 13. Happy Friday, everybody.